The town of Providence Creek, Dakota Territory, held its breath in the autumn of 1876. It was a shallow, anxious breath, tasting of wood smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of impending frost. The prairie grasses had turned a brittle shade of gold, and the wind, sweeping down from the north, carried a new kind of authority. It was a wind that spoke not of seasons changing, but of an ending. Old Man Hemlock, who had trapped these lands for 50 years and had a face like a weathered map, claimed the squirrels were gathering pine cones with a frantic desperation he had not seen since the winter of '48. A winter that had left 3-foot drifts inside locked cabins and erased entire herds of buffalo from the plains. Alara Vance felt that ending in her bones. At 22, she was a widow, a designation that in Providence Creek rendered a woman both invisible and conspicuous. Her husband, Thomas, a man of gentle hands and boundless optimism, had been taken by a threshing accident in the late spring. He had left her a quarter section of land on the windswept rise west of town, a mortgaged farmhouse that seemed to shrink with every gust of wind, and a woodpile that was a monument to his unfinished work. It was a meager fortress against the coming siege of winter, and Alara knew it was not enough. She was a woman forged in practicality, not hysterics. Her grandfather, a surveyor who had married a woman of the Arikara people, had raised her after her parents succumbed to cholera. He had filled her head not with needlepoint and scripture, but with principles of thermodynamics, the wisdom of the Earth Lodge, and the unyielding mathematics of survival. He had taught her to observe, to calculate, and to trust the ancient, patient wisdom of the ground beneath her feet over the proud, foolish structures men built upon it. On October 12, 1876, Alara stood before the Providence Creek Town Council. The room, smelling of stale tobacco and wool, was presided over by Alderman Finch, a man whose burgeoning belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, and whose certainty was as vast and unyielding as the prairie itself. He was flanked by Silas Croft, the town's master carpenter, and Jedediah Stone, a farmer whose landholdings were second only to Finch's. "Alderman Finch," Alara began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the cold dread that had prompted her appearance. "I have calculated my current supply of seasoned oak and cottonwood. At a conservative burn rate necessary to keep a single room above freezing, it will be exhausted by the middle of January. I believe others in this town, particularly the newer families, are in a similar position. I propose a communal audit of our wood supplies and the formation of a contingency reserve." Finch leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He exchanged a patronizing smile with Croft. "My dear Mistress Vance," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "while we appreciate your civic-mindedness, I assure you the men of this town are perfectly capable of providing for their own families. We are not a charity. Perhaps if your late husband had been more industrious—" "My husband's industry is not the issue," Alara interrupted, her voice hardening. "The issue is a meteorological probability. The signs all point to a winter of unusual severity. A communal reserve is not charity. It is prudent planning." Silas Croft, a man who believed the quality of a structure could be judged by the sheer volume of lumber it contained, scoffed aloud. "Prudent planning? Young woman, we build sturdy, God-fearing American homes here. Frame and plank. We are not savages huddling in mud huts. A proper house, a proper stove, and a proper man to chop the wood is all the prudence one needs." The dismissal was absolute. It was not just a rejection of her proposal, but a rejection of her, a dismissal of her right to speak on matters of substance. She was a woman, a widow, an inconvenient reminder of fragility in a town built on the illusion of frontier invincibility. She saw the closed faces, the smirks, the comfortable certainty of men who had never had to count their firewood, one stick at a time. She was 16 years old when her grandfather passed, and he had left her with his books, his tools, and a final piece of advice. Men who build high walls against the wind do not understand that the wind is not their enemy. The cold is. And the greatest shield against the cold is the earth itself. Alara left the meeting not with despair, but with a cold, hard resolve. They would not help her. Their pride and their traditions were walls they could not see past. So be it. She would not rely on their charity, their prudence, or their sturdy, God-fearing houses that leaked heat like a sieve. She would rely on her grandfather's wisdom. She would trust the earth. On her long walk back to her lonely farmhouse, under a sky the color of slate, Alara Vance made a decision. She would not buy more wood. She would build a new home. The plan that took shape in her mind over the next several days was a synthesis of ancient knowledge and modern principles. It was a design born from the earth lodges of the Mandan and Arikara, structures her grandfather had sketched and studied with reverent admiration, combined with the structural engineering concepts from a dog-eared German textbook he owned on parabolic arches. She would not build upon the land. She would build within it. She envisioned a long, low structure, dug into the south-facing slope of the hill behind her existing house. The back and sides would be completely subterranean, protected by the immense thermal mass of the earth, while the front would be a small, glazed facade designed to capture every precious ray of the low winter sun. The roof would be a vaulted arch, a form that could bear an immense load, which would be covered not with shingles, but with layers of sod and soil. She spent 2 days refining the drawings on butcher paper, her calculations precise. The interior living space would be a single, long room, 40 feet in length and 18 feet wide. The excavation would need to be 8 feet deep at the rear wall, tapering to ground level at the front. She designed a central masonry heater based on the Rumford principle of a tall, shallow firebox that radiated heat more efficiently into the room rather than up the chimney. The chimney itself would be a thick column of stone and clay, a thermal battery to store and slowly release warmth long after the fire had died down. A small insulated door would open into a sunken entryway, a cold trap designed to prevent drafts from reaching the main living space. With her plans finalized, Alara liquidated her few remaining assets. She sold her husband's good pocket watch, a team of 2 aging oxen she could no longer afford to feed, and a small parcel of her land furthest from the creek. The transactions brought her a total of $92 in silver coins. It was a meager war chest for such an ambitious project, but it would have to be enough. Before she began the work, a sense of propriety demanded she inform the town council of her intentions. It was not a request for permission, but a declaration of independence. She found Alderman Finch overseeing the loading of flour sacks at the general store. He listened with an expression of bemused disbelief as she laid out her plan, not with drawings, but with concise, declarative sentences. "I will be excavating a dwelling on my property," she stated. "The funds I have acquired will be used for materials, not for additional firewood." Finch's face, already ruddy from the autumn air, darkened to a deep crimson. "You will what? You intend to dig a hole and live in it like a badger? Mistress Vance, have you taken leave of your senses? The ground freezes 5 feet deep in this territory." "Which is why the floor will be 10 feet below the frost line at its deepest point," Alara replied calmly. "The earth below the frost line maintains a near constant temperature, approximately 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature I will be starting with. Your house starts with whatever temperature the air is, which will soon be well below zero. I am simply choosing a more sensible starting point. Her use of logic and specific figures seemed to infuriate him more than any emotional plea ever could. He sputtered, searching for a response that could reassert his authority. Just then, Silas Croft and Jedediah Stone approached, their curiosity piqued. Finch seized the opportunity to create an audience. "Silas, Jedediah, come and hear this," Finch boomed, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Mistress Vance here, our town's foremost expert on winter preparedness, has decided she will not be needing firewood this winter. She intends to dig herself a cave and live in it. A tomb, more like." Silas Croft ran a hand over his beard, his eyes filled with a carpenter's professional disdain. "A hole in the ground? Ma'am, with all due respect, a structure needs a proper foundation, joists, king posts, a pitched roof to shed the snow. You can't just bend some sticks and cover them with dirt. The weight of the first heavy snow will crush you flat. It's a suicide." "It is a catenary arch," Ilara stated, her patience wearing thin. "It is the strongest shape to bear a static load. The weight of the earth and snow will compress and strengthen the structure, not crush it. It is a principle of engineering." Jedediah Stone, a man of simple, unshakable convictions, just shook his head slowly. "It ain't right, Mistress Vance. It ain't natural for a Christian soul to live beneath the ground. That's for the dead. You'll catch a lung sickness from the damp, and that'll be the end of you. It's a fool's errand. A tragic one." The conversation was over. The verdict had been delivered. In the days and weeks that followed, her project became a source of grim entertainment for the town. Men would ride out to the edge of her property to watch her toil, shaking their heads and making wagers on when she would give up, or when the first snowfall would collapse her prairie dog burrow. They called it Vance's Folly. The name stuck. But Ilara did not hear them. She had work to do. The labor began on October 20th, 1876. Her tools were a heavy pickaxe that jarred her shoulders with every swing, a worn spade, and a rickety wheelbarrow with a squeaking axle that became the soundtrack to her days. The work was brutal, a relentless battle against the compacted soil of the prairie. She rose before the sun, her hands already raw, and worked until the last light failed, stopping only to eat cold biscuits and drink water from a jug. The first few days were the hardest, breaking through the thick mat of prairie grass roots. But once she was through that, the digging settled into a grueling rhythm. Swing the pick, pry the earth loose, shovel it into the barrow, haul it to the growing pile that would later be used to cover the roof. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her back ached with a deep, constant fire, and her hands, despite being wrapped in cloth, were a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She was driven by a quiet, cold fury and the unshakable certainty of her grandfather's teachings. The men who watched from a distance saw a lone, foolish woman digging her own grave. They did not see the precise sloping lines she was carving, the careful attention to drainage, the methodical execution of a brilliant plan. They saw folly because they could not comprehend the wisdom. By the first week of November, the excavation was complete. A great earthen wound scarred the hillside, 40 feet long, 18 feet wide, perfectly aligned with a southern exposure. The townspeople saw a pit. Ilara saw the foundation of her survival. She then began the most arduous task, hauling field stones from the creek bed a quarter-mile away. She used the wheelbarrow, loading it with stones until she could barely move it, her body straining with every step. These stones, weighing between 20 and 50 pounds each, were meticulously laid to form a low, 2-foot-high foundation wall along the perimeter of the earthen floor. It was slow, back-breaking work, but this stone footing would anchor the arched ribs of the roof and prevent moisture from wicking up from the soil. Next came the frame. She could not afford milled lumber, so she traveled to the thickets along Providence Creek and with a small handsaw and an axe, harvested 24 young cottonwood and willow saplings. She chose them for their length and flexibility, each one about 4 inches in diameter at its base. Back at the building site, she dug a long, narrow pit, filled it with water, and built a slow-burning fire alongside it. She placed the saplings in the trench, covering it with sod to trap the heat and steam. For 2 days she tended the fire, keeping the water simmering, softening the wood fibers. This was a technique her grandfather had learned from the Arikara, a way to make green wood pliable without compromising its strength. Then came the bending. Working quickly while the wood was still hot and supple, she and a simple lever and fulcrum system she devised using a large boulder bent each sapling into a perfect parabolic arch. The ends of the arches were notched and fitted securely into the stone foundation on either side of the excavation. One by one, the pale, skeletal ribs rose against the autumn sky. She hoisted a heavy, 40-foot cottonwood log into place as the central ridgepole, a task that took her 3 full days of painstaking effort with ropes and levers. The resulting frame looked like the bleached skeleton of some immense, prehistoric beast, half buried in the earth. The sight only confirmed the town's derision. Silas Croft declared it an offense to the craft of carpentry. The next phase required the bulk of her meager funds. She rode her lone mare into town and purchased the materials. From the general store, she bought 3 massive bolts of heavy canvas, the kind used for wagon covers, and every ball of twine they had. This cost her $19. She then went to the carpenter, Silas Croft himself, to purchase 2 glazed window sashes. He charged her a premium, his face a mask of smug pity. The glass cost her $12. The final stop was the blacksmith, from whom she bought nails, hinges, and a long length of stovepipe, for a total of $27. The total expenditure was $58, leaving her with $34. She knew she would need every remaining penny for food and other necessities. Back at the site, she began the critical process of sheathing and waterproofing her structure. She stretched the heavy canvas tarps over the arched frame, pulling them taut and stitching the seams together with the twine, her fingers growing numb in the increasingly cold air. When the entire frame was covered in a skin of canvas, she undertook the waterproofing. She had spent weeks rendering tallow from the fat of a single pig she had slaughtered and collecting beeswax from a wild hive she had discovered. Now, she melted the tallow and wax together in a large cauldron over a fire, creating a thick, pungent, and waterproof sealant. For days, she painstakingly painted this foul-smelling mixture onto the canvas, layer after layer, until it was a thick, greasy, impermeable membrane. The final and most crucial layer was the earth itself. She began by cutting blocks of thick prairie sod, the roots still intact, and laying them carefully over the waterproofed canvas like immense, living shingles. She started at the bottom and worked her way up, overlapping each layer to ensure a tight seal. This sod layer would not only provide insulation, but would also prevent the loose soil from eroding. Once the sod was in place, she began the monumental task of moving the mountain of earth she had excavated. Wheelbarrow load by wheelbarrow load, she piled the soil back onto the structure, covering the roof and banking it high against the rear and side walls until the dwelling seemed to be a natural extension of the hill itself. The earth berm was over 4 feet thick in most places. The town saw a woman burying her house. Alara knew she was blanketing it in the planet's own insulation. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of damp earth and tallow. But it was still. The ever-present prairie wind was gone, its voice silenced by the tons of soil. She installed the 2 windows on the south-facing facade, carefully sealing the edges with clay and moss. Light, pale and thin, now filled the space. Her final interior project was the masonry heater. Using clay mixed with prairie grass from the creek bank and stones she had split herself, she constructed the Rumford-style fireplace and the thick, winding chimney that snaked up through the earthen roof. It was not beautiful, but it was functional. A marvel of thermal engineering designed for maximum heat with minimal fuel. On December 15, 1876, she moved in. She carried her few possessions from the cold, drafty farmhouse: a rope bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a trunk of her grandfather's books, and her meager kitchen supplies. The farmhouse she left to the wind. That evening, she lit the first fire in her new home. It was a small fire, just a few pieces of oak, but the effect was astonishing. The heat radiated out into the room, and the stone of the heater and chimney grew warm to the touch. Outside, the temperature was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, with a tiny fire and the heat from a single cooking pot, her prized thermometer registered a comfortable 65 degrees. The air was still and silent. She had done it. Vance's folly was complete. She was ready. December 18th arrived not with a dawn, but with a gradual, grudging retreat of a darkness that seemed reluctant to release its grip on the world. The sky was a low, bruised ceiling of solid gray, and the air was unnaturally still and heavy, carrying a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight. Ilara, snug within her earthen shelter, felt the change in barometric pressure as a dull ache in her joints. She added a single split log to the masonry heater, where a bed of coals glowed from the night before, and watched the thermometer on the wall. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 5 degrees below zero and falling. By midday, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a picturesque winter day, but small, hard, granular pellets, driven by a rising wind that moaned like a dying animal. Within an hour, the world beyond her 2 small windows had dissolved into a churning, horizontal vortex of white. The wind, which had been a moan, rose to a shriek, then to a deafening, unceasing roar. It was a physical assault, a solid wall of sound and fury that seemed intent on scouring the world clean. Inside the shelter, the storm was an abstraction. The roaring of the wind was muted by the tons of earth surrounding her, reduced to a distant, deep hum, like the blood in one's own ears. There were no drafts, no rattling window panes, no whistling through cracks in the walls. The silence and stillness were absolute, a pocket of profound calm carved from the heart of a maelstrom. She sat at her small table, reading one of her grandfather's books on geology, the light from her kerosene lamp casting a warm, golden glow. The masonry heater radiated a steady, gentle warmth. The thermometer held firm at 68 degrees. She was an island of temperate stability in an ocean of lethal cold. In Providence Creek, a mile to the east, there was no such peace. The town was in a state of siege. The wind, armed with ice and snow, found every imperfection in the proud, wood-frame houses that Silas Croft had built. It forced its way through window sashes, under doors, and between the very planks of the walls. Icy drafts snaked across floors, killing the heat from the pot-bellied stoves that now roared day and night, consuming wood at a terrifying pace. Families huddled together in a single room, stuffing rags and blankets into the cracks. But it was a losing battle. The cold was an insidious, relentless invader. Alderman Finch sat in his parlor, the largest in town, wrapped in a buffalo robe. His stove, a magnificent cast-iron beast from St. Louis, was glowing cherry red, yet he could see his own breath. The temperature in the room was barely 40 degrees. He had already sent his son twice to the woodshed, and the pile of logs that he had believed would last until February was visibly shrinking. A knot of fear, cold and tight, was forming in his ample belly. He thought of the smug certainty with which he had dismissed the widow Vance. The thought was an unwelcome intrusion, and he pushed it away with anger. The temperature continued its terrifying descent. By the morning of the second day, December 19th, it was 30 degrees below zero. The wind had not slackened. If anything, it had intensified. The world was a formless, howling chaos. Snow was piling in immense drifts, burying fences, sheds, and the lower floors of houses. In the home of Jedediah Stone, the situation was becoming desperate. They had burned through their main woodpile and were now dismantling a small chicken coop in the attached shed for fuel. The green, unseasoned wood sputtered and smoked, giving off precious little heat. His wife was weeping quietly, cradling their youngest child, whose lips had a bluish tint. "It's no good, Martha," Jedediah said, his voice hoarse. "This fire won't last the night. We're freezing to death in our own home." He looked out the frosted window at the impossible storm. And then, a thought. A memory of a foolish woman digging a hole in a hill, pierced through his pride and his fear. Vance's folly. The tomb. The prairie dog burrow. It was a mad hope, an impossible one, but it was the only hope they had. "Stay here," he told his wife. "Keep the children wrapped. I'm going out." Wrapping his face in scarves until only his eyes were visible, Jedediah Stone plunged into the blizzard. The force of the wind knocked him to his knees. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. He could not see more than 3 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory and instinct, a slow, desperate crawl through waist-deep snow, following the line of a fence he knew led toward the Vance property. It was a journey of a single mile, but it felt like 100. His beard froze solid. Ice crystals formed on his eyelashes, momentarily sealing his eyes shut. He was on the verge of collapse, his body screaming for him to lie down and let the sleep of the snow take him, when he stumbled against something solid. It was the south-facing facade of Alara's shelter, nearly buried in a drift, only the tops of the windows visible. He clawed at the snow, his frozen fingers finding the outline of the door. He banged on it with what little strength he had left, his fist making a dull, pathetic thud. The door swung inward, and the change was so abrupt it was disorienting. He fell from a world of screaming wind and brutal, killing cold into a pocket of warm, silent, lamplit air. He collapsed onto the floor of the sunken entryway, gasping. Alara stood over him, holding a lamp. She looked, not surprised, but expectant. The warmth was the first thing he registered. A gentle, enveloping heat that felt like life itself. The second was the air. It was still. Utterly, completely still. He looked up at her, his face a mask of frost and frozen tears. "My family," he croaked, the words tearing at his raw throat. "The fire is out. We're freezing." Alara looked at the man who had openly mocked her, who had called her home a grave. She felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sorrow. "Bring them," she said, her voice even. "Follow the rope." He looked down and saw she had tied one end of a long coil of rope to a hook inside the door, the rest of it trailing out into the storm. She had been waiting. She had known they would come. Jedediah, fortified by a mug of hot broth Alara gave him, made the agonizing journey back to his house, guided by the lifeline. He returned half an hour later, his wife and 3 children in tow, all of them on the verge of collapse from hypothermia. Alara helped them inside, stripped them of their frozen outer garments, and wrapped them in blankets near the gentle, radiant heat of the masonry stove. They huddled together, silent, their eyes wide with disbelief at the impossible warmth and tranquility of the shelter. They were not the last. The news of Jedediah's survival, or perhaps the simple, desperate logic of shared crisis, spread through the frozen town. An hour later, it was Silas Croft, the master carpenter, who appeared at the door. His face was gray with cold, his usual arrogance replaced by a raw, humbled fear. His wife was with him, her hands showing the pale, waxy signs of severe frostbite. "Mistress Vance," Croft stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Our house, it's like an icebox. We saw the light in your windows." He could not bring himself to ask for help, but his eyes pleaded. "There is room by the fire," Alara said, her voice devoid of accusation. She helped his wife, tending to her frost-bitten hands with a gentle efficiency that shamed him more than any rebuke could have. Throughout the long night and into the third day of the storm, they kept coming. The Dyers, the Millers, the Peterson family with their newborn baby. They arrived in twos and threes, ghosts emerging from the white hell, drawn to the two small squares of light that signified an impossible sanctuary. Alara's shelter, designed for one, now held 17 people. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies, but it remained warm. The masonry heater, fed by a single small log every few hours, continued its steady, miraculous work. The body heat of the occupants contributed, turning the small space into a life-sustaining haven. Her former tormentors were now her wards, their lives dependent on the very structure they had ridiculed. Not one of them had lost a family member. Not one had burned through their wood supply with such profligate folly. And not one, huddled in the life-saving warmth of Vance's folly, would ever again doubt the wisdom of the earth. The last to arrive, late on the evening of the third day, was Alderman Finch. He did not knock. The door was opened to admit another family, and he simply appeared behind them, a hulking, defeated shape framed by the swirling snow. His face was a mask of utter humiliation. He herded his wife and 2 daughters inside, his eyes refusing to meet Alara's. He saw the faces of his constituents, Jedediah Stone, Silas Croft, families he was supposed to lead and protect, all of them refugees in a dirt-covered dwelling he had called a tomb. He saw the calm, steady warmth, the quiet order, the single woman who had foreseen this catastrophe and prepared for it with a wisdom he could not comprehend. He, the leader of the town, had brought his family to the brink of death through his own arrogant pride. She, the outcast widow, had provided the salvation. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some apology or explanation, but the words would not come. What could he say? He simply removed his frozen coat, found a small space for his family on the floor, and sat down amongst the others. His surrender was silent, and it was absolute. Alara simply handed him a tin cup of hot tea, her expression unreadable. In that moment, surrounded by the people she had saved, she was not their judge. She was merely their anchor in the storm. The great blizzard finally broke on the morning of December 21st. The wind died, and a strange, brilliant, and blinding silence fell over the world. The sun rose in a sky of crystalline blue, casting its light upon a landscape transformed, a world buried and scoured by the storm. When the survivors emerged from Alara's shelter, they stepped into a world of alien beauty and profound devastation. The snow was piled in drifts 15 feet high, sculpting the prairie into a new and terrifying geography. The town of Providence Creek was a graveyard of frozen houses, their windows shattered by the wind, their interiors filled with snow. The human cost was revealed over the next few days. The Hemlock family, who lived on a remote claim to the north, were found frozen in their beds. 2 prospectors in a lean-to by the creek were never found at all. In town, the elderly Mr. Abernathy had succumbed to the cold in his own armchair, his fire long dead. The final toll was 7 lives lost. 7 people who had died in their sturdy, God-fearing American homes, while 17 others had survived in a hole in the ground. The irony was as bitter and cold as the air itself. A week later, on a day so cold the simple act of breathing was painful, a town meeting was convened in the still frigid shell of the church. It was not a meeting of governance, but of confession. The survivors sat huddled together, their faces etched with grief and a new, terrible humility. Alderman Finch stood before them, his great bulk seeming diminished, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. He looked directly at Alara, who sat quietly in the back pew. "I have failed this town," he began, his voice cracking. "My pride, our pride, has cost us dearly. We listened to tradition when we should have listened to reason. We trusted in appearances when we should have trusted in principles. We mocked the one person whose wisdom might have saved us all." He turned to face her fully. "Mistress Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there are no words to express the depth of our shame or the extent of our gratitude. We called your home a folly. We were the fools. You built with an understanding of this land, while we built in defiance of it. We asked that you accept our apology, and we beg, that you teach us." Silas Croft, the master carpenter, stood next. "What I built," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the frozen town, "was just wood and nails. It was arrogance. What you built, Mistress Vance, was a home. It was shelter. I spent my life working with wood, and I never understood the simple truth that a 4-foot wall of earth is warmer than a 4-inch wall of pine. I would be honored if you would teach me the principles of your construction." Alara rose. She looked at the faces before her, stripped of their pride, united in their loss and their newfound respect. There was no triumph in her heart, only the somber weight of the moment and the memory of the 7 who were gone. "There is no magic in what I did," she said, her voice carrying through the cold, silent church. "My grandfather taught me that the principles of survival are written into the world itself, for anyone who is humble enough to read them. We cannot command the prairie to be gentle. We must learn to live with it as it is. We cannot defeat the cold. We must seek refuge from it in the warmth of the earth." That spring, the sound of construction in Providence Creek was different. It was not the high-pitched whine of saws cutting planks, but the rhythmic scrape of shovels digging into the earth. Guided by Alara's plans and her patient instruction, the townspeople began to build anew. They dug into the south-facing slopes, laid foundations of fieldstone, and learned to steam and bend green wood into strong, graceful arches. They learned the proper way to lay sod and the principles of the thermal chimney. The men who had once mocked her now listened with reverent attention as she explained the concepts of thermal mass, passive solar gain, and cold sinks. They did not abandon their old homes, but they augmented them, building earth-bermed shelters for the winter months, connected by sunken, protected walkways. The town began to sink into the landscape, to become a part of it rather than a temporary imposition upon it. Vance's Folly became known as the Providence Model, and visitors from other settlements would come to marvel at the strange, low-slung dwellings that remained cool in the brutal summer heat and stayed warm through the winter with a fraction of the fuel. Ilara Vance, the outcast widow, became Ilara the Founder, the quiet sage whose wisdom had been forged in loss and vindicated by the unforgiving logic of the natural world. She never sought power or praise, but she earned a respect more profound than any elected office could bestow. She had trusted the earth, and in doing so, she had taught a town of proud, stubborn people the most fundamental lesson of the frontier. Survival is not a matter of domination, but of understanding.